They say every family has a breaking point, but I didn't know ours would arrive in the shape of a binder heavy enough to change the way we looked at each other. When my father grew ill, I stepped quietly into the role no one else wanted. The late-night drives to the pharmacy, the morning spent helping him down the hallway, the bills that crept in like shadows. None of it felt extraordinary at the time. It was just what you do when love turns into responsibility. I didn't keep score. I didn't expect applause. I assumed, naively, that the truth of those years would simply stand on its own. But grief has a way of rearranging people. When Dad passed, the conversations that should have brought us closer instead became sharp-edged. My sister and I stood on opposite sides of the same loss, and somehow we saw entirely different versions of what had happened. That was when the binder entered the story. Page after page of dates, receipts, confirmations, signatures. Not a weapon, not a shield. Just a record of the life I had lived beside him. It was the only way to keep the truth from slipping through the cracks of emotion and memory. And yet, in building it, I learned that clarity can feel like accusation to someone who wasn't there. This is the story of how we reached the breaking point, and how, against the odds, we learned to walk back from it without losing ourselves in the process. If this feels like a story you've lived through, or one you've tried to survive in your own family, stay with me. There's more ahead. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapters of this journey. I placed the binder on the table, the way a clerk might set down an item meant for inspection. Square, centered, unshaken. The pages inside were already divided by thin plastic tabs I'd labeled in a clean, steady hand. Hours, receipts, mileage, supplies. I breathed in slowly, the kind you take when you want your ribs to remember their job. On the first sheet, under a narrow header, I wrote, Day 1 after the funeral. Summary begins. The words felt clinical, but they were intentional. Facts first, no arguments. Just the record of what happened and when. The house was quiet, the air thin with the aftertaste of too many whispered condolences. Yet my pen moved with a kind of practiced steadiness, a rhythm that didn't need permission from grief or guilt. My phone lit up with a muted glow, my sister's message. We split everything tonight, right? The sentence hovered without context, without acknowledgement of the weeks that had preceded it. I kept the screen beside me as I resumed marking each week of caregiving hours with a thin stroke of blue ink. We follow the process, I murmured to no one, as though my own voice needed the reminder. The spreadsheet lines met the quiet room like rails laid for a train that had to stay straight. No speeding, no shortcuts. Her text blinked once more, waiting, but the ledger in front of me held priority. I began laying out the timeline. Advances paid, supplies purchased, transfers logged in the margins of my bank statements. Every medical item bought for Dad had a place here. Every late-night drive, every delivery. Every time I paid out of pocket because it was simpler than asking. A small yellow sticky note sat near the corner of the page. Deductions before distribution. It fluttered slightly when I shifted the binder, as though nodding in agreement. My heartbeat stayed even, my hand steady. It wasn't anger that guided me, just clarity, the kind you reach when you finally stop negotiating with yourself. I drafted the email with a title that carried no apology and no sharpness, just clarity. Caregiving reimbursement prior to distribution. Ledger attached. Then I attached the 4-column summary, each row documented and unchanged from the facts. The tone was intentionally sparse. Conditions stated, sequence outlined. No embellishment. The cursor blinked at the end of the final line, as if expecting second thoughts, but there were none. I read it once more for accuracy, not emotion. The document stood on its own. Before sending it, I called the county clerk's office and scheduled an appointment to submit the probate materials. Their instructions were procedural: upload via portal, attach supporting scans, confirm receipt. And I followed each step like I was assembling a quiet argument. My checklist waited beside me: PDFs, photos, signatures, timestamps. Nothing missing, nothing padded. When I finished, I aligned the binder with the edge of the table, its weight steadying, almost grounding. Then I pressed send. The phone buzzed 3 times and fell silent, as though even it understood the shift in air. I didn't pick it up. My hand rested still on the edge of the binder, the lamplight sliding over its vinyl surface in a soft golden line. For a moment that light touched the metal ring like a signal, subtle, but unmistakably there. I gathered the CareShift confirmations the home care aide had signed over the years. Small slips of paper, creased from being tucked in pockets and drawers. Each signature carried a quiet familiarity, the kind that comes from countless early mornings and late nights. I took photos of them on my kitchen counter, aligning the edges so the timestamps were visible. Then I called the neighbor, who had often stepped in during emergencies. "Can you confirm these dates?" I asked. He did, without hesitation, his voice steady. I slid the confirmations into a folder labeled simply, "Hours." No commentary, just documentation. My sister avoided signing anything, telling relatives, "You can't measure love in money." The phrase echoed through group messages like a moral verdict, but it didn't match the facts. I opened the spreadsheet I had maintained from 2021 through 2024 and expanded the column holding the logged hours. "We measure what happened," I whispered. The screen cast a faint blue glow on the countertop. I saved the file again, not because it needed an update, but because the act itself steadied me. Her refusal didn't remove the truth. It only postponed its acknowledgement. I took photos of the pill organizer, the monthly injection schedule, and the bruises that appeared each time I repositioned Dad to keep him comfortable. The antiseptic smell from those nights rose faintly in my memory, sharp, cold, familiar. I labeled each image with dates and short notes. Verification, not emotion. The photos weren't meant to shame anyone. They were proof of the unseen hours, the ones that passed quietly under fluorescent kitchen lights. I placed them in a digital folder on my desktop and backed them up, a small insurance against future doubt. I created a new section in the ledger for lost wages, a column I had avoided filling in for a long time. My employment record showed the shifts I declined, the weeks I rearranged, the overtime I gave up because caregiving always came first. The entries felt strangely intimate, more personal than any medical receipt. They were the cost of being present, a calculation no one sees when they say they would have helped if they'd known. I added the numbers slowly, making sure each deduction corresponded to a dated time card. A few relatives asked, over a casual group call, why things were becoming so tense. I answered with the same calm tone I used with customer service agents. "Because fairness depends on clarity," I said. They went quiet. It wasn't hostility, just discomfort. The kind that appears when someone realizes a conversation is shifting from sentiment to structure. I didn't fill the silence. I let it settle like dust on an old mantle, undisturbed, honest. I scheduled a preliminary video meeting and sent the link with a fixed 30-minute limit. No open-ended discussions. No wandering off into what-ifs or who meant well. The confirmation dinged softly on my screen. I closed the binder, pressed its spine once with my palm, and stepped away from the table to drink a glass of water. My throat eased a little, though my eyes still felt dry from nights that had stretched longer than they should have. The doctor's letter arrived in a thin envelope, the kind that usually carries routine updates no one remembers to read. Inside, though, the handwriting and clinical checkboxes formed a quiet map of the final years. Homebound status. Assistance required for basic daily activities. Recurring medical oversight. I read it at the kitchen counter, the afternoon light slipping across the page in a narrow beam. There was nothing dramatic in the doctor's phrasing, just the truth set down with professional restraint. I placed the letter into the appendix section of the binder, sliding it behind a plastic sleeve so the ink would stay crisp. Then I sat for a moment, letting the calm certainty of documented need settle through me. These weren't arguments. They were facts, observed and written by someone with no stake in our family's disagreements. When I closed the binder, the soft click felt like a promise to keep the record whole. I turned to the list of out-of-pocket expenses I had advanced over the years. Adult diapers, gloves, disinfectant, wound care pads, and countless small items purchased without a second thought because Dad needed them immediately. I had photographed every receipt, aligning each with its transaction code. The pattern was stark. Dates clustering during his worst weeks, amounts rising whenever the care aid was off and I took over entirely. I arranged the receipts into a single timeline, creating a visual proof of continuity. As I scrolled through the images on my screen, I felt a quiet steadiness settle in. These were not exaggerated claims or emotional recollections. They were the physical imprints of choices I made out of necessity, out of love, and out of responsibility. I added the final image and exported the file, labeling it without flourish. My sister sent over a drafted equal split proposal, asking for signatures by evening. The tone was hurried, almost casual, as though the past 3 years could be compressed into a single gesture for convenience. I read it twice, noting how it bypassed every step we had discussed. There was no mention of reimbursements, no acknowledgement of medical expenses or labor hours. I typed a single sentence in reply. We finalize reimbursement before any distribution. Then I pushed the laptop slightly away from me, letting the stillness around the words take shape. It wasn't conflict. It was correction of procedure. I filed her draft under a new folder labeled Incoming Proposals, a neutral title that helped me stay in the space of clarity rather than reaction. My pulse stayed even as I returned to the ledger. I added a section for all clinic and emergency visits, each date matched with a driving log I had kept on my phone. The routes were familiar, long stretches of quiet roads that blurred during late-night runs, early mornings when the frost clung to the windshield, and afternoons when Dad needed immediate attention. I printed the small maps and taped tiny arrows marking each departure and return. The details were mundane, almost plain, but they were part of the truth that often goes unseen when people claim they helped when they could. I took care to ensure every note was accurate, cross-checked against appointment summaries. When I finished, the timeline read like a clean sequence rather than an accusation. I closed the page gently, letting the facts speak without commentary. Sleep deprivation is rarely recorded anywhere, but I logged the fragmented nights when Dad called for help, when medication schedules slipped into the early hours, when alarms went off because his breathing pattern changed. I created a line in the ledger titled Interrupted Rest, not to claim compensation, but to show the full picture of care. Each entry was short: 1:40 a.m. repositioning, 3:12 a.m. bath, 4:57 a.m. monitor check. Seeing them together created a strange ache, not of resentment but of recognition. These were the unseen parts of caregiving, the ones that don't show on receipts. I placed the page into the binder, feeling its thin weight become part of the full record. Before closing for the night, I wrote a reminder to finish the first version of the ledger by midnight. The digital clock blinked 22:40. The room washed in a low hum from the refrigerator. My eyes felt heavy, but my mind stayed clear. Each document added, each log completed, each confirmation gathered. I saved the most recent file and shut the laptop, the lid closing softly like a book ending a chapter. Once this is done, I'll sleep, I told myself. I pressed my hand flat on the binder for a second, grounding myself in its quiet solidity, then turned off the kitchen light. My sister called through video, her voice sharpened by frustration before the screen had even focused. "You're turning Dad into invoices," she said, the words overlapping the connection's slight delay. Her face was framed by the glare of a ceiling light, features tense, breath uneven. I held the phone steady on the table instead of in my hand, letting the distance serve as a small buffer. "I'm documenting what happened," I answered, slow enough that each syllable stayed level. The calmness wasn't strategy, it was necessity. I kept my eyes on the binder beside me, its quiet structure reminding me there was nothing to defend, only to present. Her voice rose, but I didn't match it. I stayed with the facts the way a clerk stays with a form regardless of who's speaking. I shared my screen and opened the ledger, clean rows, 4 columns, timestamps, receipts. I scrolled through each section without commentary, letting the cursor pause over the column labeled evidence. I could see her shift slightly, maybe expecting some emotional appeal. Instead, I showed the same sequence I had shown the probate clerk. Hours logged, expenses advanced, care tasks recorded. "Where do you sign?" I asked quietly, staying practical. The question wasn't a threat, it was procedure. She didn't answer immediately. I could see the reflection of the spreadsheet in her glasses, small blue grids mirrored against her hesitation. I waited, maintaining the evenness of my breath. She tried again with a shortcut. "Let's just sign the 50-50 now and figure the rest out later." The phrasing was familiar, something she had used before whenever details became inconvenient. I opened a new window and typed a simple sentence. "No distribution occurs before reimbursement." Then I read it aloud once, letting the clarity settle between us. Her sigh reached through the speakers, long and edged with impatience. I didn't respond to the tone. Instead, I returned to the ledger window and reorganized the tabs, aligning the documents by date. Each movement of the cursor felt like a metronome, keeping the conversation from drifting into sentiment. We stayed in the frame of what had happened, nothing else. I sent the official meeting invite for the session with the estate attorney. The agenda sat neatly inside the email, 5 bullet points, no room for detours. I could almost predict her reaction, but I kept the email factual. When the notification pinged confirming she'd received it, I exhaled a small breath I hadn't noticed holding. I printed 2 additional copies of the ledger, the warm paper sliding out in a slow rhythm. The printer's faint mechanical scent filled the kitchen, grounding me in a quiet practicality. I stacked the pages, tapped them into alignment, and clipped them together. Each step was deliberate, not aggressive, not defensive, just precise. I fed the pages into the scanner, the light bar gliding steadily beneath each sheet. The whir of the machine filled the room with a soft, repetitive hum. The digital images appearing on my laptop were crisp, the signatures sharp, the notes exactly where they needed to be. The repetition of scanning felt almost meditative. Load, close, wait. Load, close, wait. The routine brought a steadiness that conversations never seemed to hold. When the final file uploaded, I labeled it with the date and placed it into the portal draft for the clerk's office. Nothing hurried, nothing hidden, everything accounted for. The machine's last pass left a faint streak of blue light across the page on the screen before fading out. I looked at it for a moment, recognizing how every step, from phone call to scan, had settled me deeper into a place where clarity outweighed conflict. I closed the laptop and let the silence return, settling into the room like soft dust after a storm. My hands rested flat on the table, steady, deliberate. There would be more discussions ahead, more tension perhaps, but the groundwork was unshakable now. I turned off the desk lamp, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway. My sister posted a short status online. 4 words meant to sting without naming anyone. Money can't buy family. The comments gathered quickly, full of sympathetic affirmations from people who knew nothing about the months and years behind that sentence. I took a screenshot, not out of pettiness but because context matters. Public narratives have a way of becoming private truths if no record exists. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the noise fade. Those words weren't about grief or remembrance. They were leverage. I set my phone down on the table, letting it face down so the light wouldn't distract me. Outside, the late afternoon drifted in quietly, indifferent to her proclamation. The binder remained where it always was, factual, unbothered, waiting. I messaged her privately. Bring numbers, not slogans. The text felt blunt, but it was the only language that held the conversation steady. There was no benefit in debating emotions broadcast to an audience. What mattered was accuracy, not volume. The typing bubble appeared and disappeared twice before she finally sent back a brief, clipped reply. I didn't respond further, choosing to step back from the spiral that public channels invite. Instead, I returned to my desk and reviewed the ledger again, each column clean, each row supported by something tangible. The contrast between record and rhetoric sharpened the air around me, but it also clarified the path forward. I opened a new sheet titled Shared, Non-Shared Expenses and began listing each category with precise distinctions. Medical necessity in one column, non-reimbursable items in another. It wasn't a moral judgment, it was structure. Clarity prevents confusion, and confusion is what leads families into long, avoidable disputes. As I typed, I remembered each moment behind those entries. Late-night pharmacy runs, emergency supply orders, small comforts bought on instinct rather than instruction. I sorted them carefully, the cursor moving with the steady rhythm of someone tracing a well-worn map. When the sheet was complete, I added it to the ledger and backed everything up twice. I called the neighbor who had helped during those colder nights when Dad's breathing faltered. Do you remember the night the snow fell early? I asked. Of course, he said. You called me past midnight. I helped you get him to the car. His recollection was clear, unprompted. I wrote down his statement and asked if he could sign a short confirmation. He agreed without hesitation. The conversation was brief, factual, warm only in its honesty. After hanging up, I added his statement to the folder. The memory of that night surfaced, how the wind bit through my coat, how Dad's fingers clutched mine. I let the memory settle before returning to the documents. I reviewed the submission deadlines for evidence, checking the probate portal for any changes in timing or format requirements. The deadline was 5 days away. I highlighted it on my calendar and set multiple alerts: morning, afternoon, night. Missing a deadline wasn't an option. The house felt still as I double-checked each file, ensuring the naming convention matched the court's guidelines. This part of the process was tedious, but the quiet repetition helped keep anxiety at bay. Order was its own kind of comfort, a steadying presence in a week full of shifting family dynamics. I paused for 5 minutes and drank a glass of water. The kitchen lights reflected on the smooth surface, creating a thin line of brightness that wavered slightly with my breath. My throat loosened, but the dryness in my eyes lingered, a reminder of how many hours had gone into the past few days. Resetting myself felt necessary, just enough space between tasks to prevent the work from swallowing me whole. When I returned to the binder, I didn't rush. I simply placed my hand on it, feeling the faint warmth of the room gathering on its cover, and let the focus come back in its own time. I opened the journal I had kept during the hardest months, its pages softened at the edges from being handled in the dark. One entry stood out, the night Dad's breathing turned heavy and uneven. I had written the time in a slanted script, the ink slightly smudged. I remembered how one hand pressed gently to his chest while the other steadied the oxygen tube. speaking to him softly even though he couldn't answer. Reading the entry now, the room felt smaller, quieter. The memory did not break me, but it did narrow the air for a moment. These weren't dramatic recollections. They were the plain record of effort, fatigue, and presence. I closed the journal halfway, leaving my thumb in the crease, and let the stillness settle again before returning to the binder. Another line caught my eye. 3:12 a.m., written next to a note about changing the bedsheet because he had sweated through it during a fever. I remembered the cold floor beneath my knees as I worked quickly, the laundry basket pulled close, the scent of detergent lingering on my hands for hours after. The entry was short, but standing inside it again, even for a few seconds, carried its weight. This was the kind of work no one ever sees, not because it's secret, but because it happens at hours when the world is asleep. I smoothed the page and added a small corner tab so I could reference it later if necessary. I slipped a photograph into the binder, a picture of Dad's slippers beside his bed, worn at the heel and slightly crooked. I had taken it one morning when he'd fallen asleep sitting up, and I didn't want to wake him by moving them. At the time it felt insignificant, but now it held the softness of small truths. The image rested between documents filled with dates and figures. It didn't argue or justify anything. It simply showed a detail of a life I had tended to. I looked at it for a moment, then returned to sorting through the paperwork. Emotion wasn't evidence, but evidence could carry traces of the life behind it. My sister sent another message. Stop making this a list of hardships. She didn't understand that I wasn't recounting anything for sympathy. I didn't reply. I saved the message quietly into the communication log, the same way I saved receipts and timestamps, not as fuel, but as record. Her words lingered for a moment, then dissolved into the steady rhythm of my work. I refused to let sentiment, hers or mine, distort what needed to be clear. I took a slow breath, letting the exhale level my focus again. The binder remained open in front of me, its pages waiting without judgment. I added a new line to the ledger titled Recovery Time After Acute Episodes, a category that accounted for the days I stayed home because Dad couldn't be left alone after a medical scare. It wasn't an embellishment, it was reality. Those days were suspended space where life narrowed to the sound of his breathing and the question of whether he would stabilize. Entering those hours felt different than the others. They carried the echo of worry I had pushed aside at the time. Still, I entered them carefully, matching each date to the doctor's notes and discharge papers. The ledger wasn't about pain. It was about accuracy. The kitchen's overhead light dimmed to its lower setting as the timer clicked, casting a softer glow across the table. The binder's shadow stretched diagonally, parts of it sharp, parts of it fading at the edges. I closed it gently, letting the cover fall into place with a muted thud. For a long moment, I sat with my hands wrapped around a warm mug, waiting for my shoulders to loosen. The night outside was quiet, no movement on the porch, no sound from the street. The work wasn't finished, but this part, this reckoning of memory and fact, had found its place. I photographed each medication label again, this time making sure the lot numbers and dosage instructions were clear. The bottles stood in a small row on the counter, their plastic surfaces catching the kitchen light. I turned them slowly to capture the angles the court might need, steadying my hands when the memory of administering them crept in. There had been nights when the pills felt like the only barrier between stability and spiraling decline. Once the images were saved, I opened the appendix and slipped the printouts into protective sleeves. No commentary, no embellishment, just the clinical record of care.
The quiet of the room accented the faint sound of the refrigerator humming behind me, a small reminder that even the appliances had witnessed more of these late-night routines than anyone in my family had. I reached out to the home care aide again, asking if she could write a short note, verifying the complexity of Dad's condition. She sent back a concise paragraph in slightly slanted handwriting, confirming his need for daily assistance with mobility, medication, and hygiene. I thanked her and placed the note into the binder with a certain kind of reverence, not emotional, but respectful of how truth can be so simply delivered. The handwriting leaned to the right, firm but not dramatic, reflecting exactly the way she had cared for him. I scanned the note, saved it under the day's date, and added a brief label. It felt like placing another anchor into the record, one that held both accuracy and quiet dignity. My sister sent an emoji, a smirking face, small and bright on the screen. It wasn't an argument, just a dismissal wrapped in something playful enough to deny its intent. I screenshotted it and filed it next to the earlier messages. The contrast between her light tone and the weight of the documents on my table was striking, but I let it pass without reaction. I had learned that silence often preserves structure better than debating sentiment. I returned to the ledger, adjusting a date and rechecking a calculation. The click of the keys kept me grounded, the rhythm clean and indifferent to whatever tone she wanted to throw into the conversation. I built a new comparison chart, what the cost would have been if we had hired full-time external care. The numbers lined up neatly across the columns, forming a quiet truth of their own. The projected cost far exceeded anything I had asked for reimbursement. I didn't add bold lines or highlights, the math spoke plainly. As I reviewed the totals, I felt a calm clarity settle in. This wasn't about proving worth.
It was about establishing baseline reality, giving shape to the invisible work that had filled entire seasons of my life. When I printed the chart, the paper felt warm in my hands, as if the machine itself understood the weight it carried. I wrote a single line in the ledger: no profit sought, only reimbursement. I placed it between two larger sections, letting it sit as its own quiet statement. It wasn't meant to persuade anyone. It was meant to capture the principle guiding every entry. Then I leaned back slightly in my chair, the wood pressing against my shoulder blades. The evening air moved in through the cracked window, carrying the faint scent of rain on pavement. I let the coolness wash over me before turning back to the work. Accuracy required steadiness, and steadiness required breath. I took another, slower one before continuing. I closed the binder and let out a long exhale, the kind that subtly shifts the weight in your chest. My hands tingled slightly from hours of typing, sorting, and aligning documents. I stretched them once, then rested them on the closed cover. The house felt still, no messages buzzing, no calls coming in. Only the steady hum of the evening settling into its own rhythm. I listened to it for a moment, letting my spine relax. The binder was ready for the next step, the next conversation, the next verification. For tonight, though, closing it felt like a small kind of completion. My sister suggested we hold a family mediation at a mutual acquaintance's house. A living room with mismatched sofas and no formal record of what would be said. She framed it as a warmer alternative, something less harsh than official meetings. I stood by the kitchen counter, reading her message twice. The idea was familiar. Soften the setting, loosen the structure, drift the conversation into feelings instead of facts. I replied with a simple sentence. We will only meet in a formal session with minutes recorded. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was necessary. Without a documented setting, everything we discussed risked becoming a blur of interpretations. I placed my phone face down and returned to the binder, letting the quiet in the room reaffirm what needed to remain clear. She brought up the 50-50 split again, this time phrased as a plea rather than a proposal. Let's just divide it now, she wrote. We can handle the details later. The simplicity of the suggestion didn't match the complexity of what we'd lived through. I read her words without irritation, only with recognition. No partial distributions, I answered. There is no before in proper accounting. My tone stayed even. I made no attempt to soften the message, just as I made no attempt to sharpen it. I closed the message thread and rechecked the ledger columns, letting the consistency of numbers wash away the pull of shortcuts. The truth didn't need speed, it needed structure. I updated the ledger to version 2, adding the new appendix sections I had gathered over the past week. The file name shifted from -01 to -02, a small detail, but a meaningful one. Accuracy meant tracking versions, not merely adjusting content. I reorganized the tabs, grouping the most essential documents together for easier review during the attorney meeting. The binder grew slightly heavier as I inserted fresh pages, the rings clicking shut with a clean, mechanical certainty. I checked the timestamps on each digital file and created a mirrored folder on my external drive. Nothing was rushed. Every action settled into place like a puzzle piece that had been waiting for its turn. I drafted a short addendum to the agreement. Reimbursement occurs before any envelope is opened, before any distribution is made, before any decisions are interpreted as final. The phrasing was precise, designed to remove loopholes or later confusion. I printed the addendum and slid it into the front sleeve of the binder, letting it sit where anyone reviewing the file would see it first. This wasn't rigidity, it was clarity. I imagined how the meeting would go, calm, direct, structured, and let that vision anchor me. The more careful the preparation, the fewer opportunities for misunderstanding. A new message came from my sister. 2 words. "You're greedy." I stared at them for a long moment, letting their weight settle outward instead of inward. Then I attached one of Dad's signed medical forms to my email draft, not as rebuttal but as reinforcement of the facts that had shaped this entire process. I didn't respond emotionally. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I filed the message into the communication log with the same neutrality I used for receipts. If anything, her accusation only made the need for documentation clearer. I kept my breathing steady and returned to the table, where the binder waited without commentary. I closed the binder and the metal rings made a small, decisive sound. The air in the room shifted slightly, as though acknowledging that another threshold had been crossed. I straightened the edges of the stack, aligned the pens beside it, and rested my hand briefly on the cover. The quiet in the house rested lightly around me, neither relief nor tension, just a stillness that came from being prepared. When I looked toward the window, the evening light had thinned into a soft gray, steady and unbroken. I let out a slow breath, knowing the next steps would require the same calm precision. But tonight, readiness itself was enough. I drafted a temporary agreement, outlining the sequence of steps we would follow before anything else moved forward. The document was brief, 3 parts, each written in plain language to prevent misinterpretation. It defined what counted as reimbursement, how evidence would be evaluated, and when distribution could occur. I read it twice, imagining how each line would land in a meeting where emotions tended to overshadow procedure. The simplicity felt like its own kind of anchor. I printed 2 copies and set them beside the binder, each page cooling under the weight of the room's quiet. This wasn't the final settlement, not yet, but it was the structure that would hold everything steady until we reached it. The estate attorney responded shortly after, replying in a measured tone that matched the document's clarity. We would need supporting evidence numbers 6, 8, and 11 before the meeting. The specificity helped. His consistency cut through the emotional fog my sister kept stirring. I noted each missing item in the margin of my planner. They weren't large gaps, just pieces that needed to be placed precisely. I opened the digital folders, confirming where each item lived and cross-checking them with their printed versions. With every completed checkmark, the path forward felt less tangled, more navigable. I added brief legal annotations to the draft, referencing the probate guidelines without venturing into unnecessary detail. The goal wasn't to overwhelm the document with jargon, but to ensure each step had a foundation. I typed slowly, keeping the tone as spare and measured as possible. When I finished, the document held the shape of something balanced, firm enough to guide us, simple enough that no one could claim confusion. I saved it under a new version name and watched the timestamp update. In this process, timestamps mattered as much as signatures. My sister shifted tactics and called our mother, hoping to sway the situation through someone who rarely challenged her. I received a long message afterward, filled with soft pressure disguised as concern. Maybe we should do things her way, she's struggling. I read it with a steady breath, then typed a single reply. We will discuss this at the scheduled meeting. I didn't explain, defend, or argue. I kept the boundary firm. This wasn't about feelings swirling in a group chat. It was about the clean, documented path we had already established. I saved the message thread as part of the record. I printed 2 clean copies of the temporary agreement, signing my name at the bottom of each. The pen glided smoothly, its ink drying in thin, even lines. I placed the marked copies into separate protective sleeves and added them to the binder's front section. The sound of paper shifting inside the plastic felt strangely grounding. I tapped the stack once against the table to align the edges, then set the binder beside my laptop. Everything was prepared for the next step. Only the meeting itself stood between the document and its purpose. I labeled the binder spine with a small strip of white tape and wrote in neat print, Ledger O2. There was a finality to the clean lettering, a sense that this version had crossed into a more stable stage. I set it upright on the shelf for a moment, considering its weight and what it represented, before returning it to the table where the work continued. The night gathered quietly around the house, settling into corners like a soft blanket. I breathed once, slow and steady, and let the stillness stretch before me. The next part of this process was ready to unfold. I added a new statement from the neighbor who had often helped during the most difficult spells, his handwriting careful, almost formal. In it, he described seeing me guide Dad down the steps on a cold morning when his joints were too stiff to manage alone. The note was simple, no embellishment, but it carried the clarity of an outside witness. I placed it into the binder behind the earlier confirmations, smoothing the page so it fit cleanly. The growing stack of corroborations felt less like evidence against someone, and more like a record of what had truly happened. I clicked the binder rings open and shut once, ensuring everything was in order before continuing. The binder had grown heavier, almost doubling since I first assembled it. When I lifted it, the weight settled into my arms with an unexpected sense of completion. For a moment, I simply held it, feeling the thickness of the pages and the work behind them. Enough, I whispered. Not in exhaustion, but in recognition. Every necessary piece was here. No excess, no inflation. Just what the years had required. I set the binder back on the table, the cover resting with a muted sound that spread quietly through the room. Hours passed without a word from my sister. The conversation thread sat stagnant, a line of dots waiting to be tapped but never touched. Silence can be strategic, a pause long enough to make someone doubt their stance. I didn't doubt. I watched the blank screen glow softly in the dim room, letting the stillness fill the space instead of resisting it. Sometimes absence spoke louder than accusation. I folded a printed receipt, aligned its edges, and slid it into the correct tab. If she needed time to recalibrate, she could take it. The process would continue either way. I returned to the ledger and moved through each entry again, looking for anything that felt unclear or open to misinterpretation. A few small lines caught my eye. Minor expenses that weren't essential and could be removed to avoid argument. I deleted them, not because they weren't real, but because they risked distraction from the core truth. Precision mattered more than completeness. I wanted the ledger to stand cleanly on its own, even under the closest scrutiny. When I finished revising, the document looked sharper, its structure tighter and more defensible. I prepared a shortened version of the ledger, 2 pages summarizing the essential data, with clean headers and bullet points. It wasn't meant to replace the full documentation, but to give a quick, accessible overview for anyone reviewing it for the first time. When the final copy printed, I held it up to the light to check for smudges, then set it beside the full binder. It struck me how different the 2 versions looked, the dense truth and the distilled one. But both were accurate. Both reflected the same care, measured in hours and receipts rather than sentiment. I placed the binder down gently, letting my fingers hover for a moment before withdrawing. The work had reached a turning point, not in drama but in completeness. I didn't need to add anything more unless someone asked. For the first time in days, the house felt slightly lighter, as though it registered the shift. I sat back in the chair, breathing evenly, and allowed a small sense of readiness to settle over me. Whatever came next, review, meeting, questions, I had already laid the ground with quiet precision. I called the county clerk early in the morning, the line picking up after 2 rings. The clerk's voice was steady, practiced, guiding me through the available appointment times. I chose one that gave enough room to prepare without inviting delay. As she read back the slot, I wrote it down in clean block letters on the corner of my planner, noting her name beside it for reference. After the call ended, I stood by the window for a moment, letting the quiet morning settle into my bones. There was something grounding about having a date set. No ambiguity, no shifting expectations. I returned to the table and placed the appointment card atop the binder, aligning its edges with the precision the process demanded. The clerk's office sent a follow-up email with specific instructions for electronic uploads, naming conventions, file sizes, grouping requirements. I read each line carefully, adjusting my digital folders to match. I renamed the documents one by one, nothing dramatic, just meticulous adjustments to ensure clarity. The rhythm of revision felt almost soothing. Each corrected file name clicked into place, tightening the structure like stitching along a seam. When I finished, I did a trial upload to ensure everything appeared clean and legible. Preparation, I reminded myself, saved time later. And time, in this process, was worth more than opinion. My sister messaged midday asking to reschedule the meeting again, this time citing errands she hadn't mentioned before. I read the request without irritation. Patterns repeat themselves until boundaries are formed around them. I offered 2 alternative windows, both close enough to keep the process moving, both structured around the calendar we had already committed to. There was no judgment in the options, only firmness. I sent the message and watched the typing indicator appear, vanish, appear again. Eventually, she settled on one of the proposed times with a curt reply. I saved the confirmation and closed the thread. I sent out the agenda again, clear, concise, numbered. It wasn't about control, it was about minimizing confusion. The agenda held the shape of the conversation we needed to have, free from detours, emotional shortcuts, or improvised interpretations. After sending it, I printed a copy and slid it into the outer pocket of the binder. The thin paper felt light, almost fragile, but the clarity it offered was solid. I imagined reading from it during the meeting, following each step with the same steady tone I had used from the beginning. Structure made even the hardest conversations survivable. I tested my microphone and camera, adjusting the settings until my voice came through without echo, and the lighting didn't cast shadows across my face. The screen reflected a calm version of me, shoulders relaxed, eyes focused, expression even. It wasn't vanity, it was preparation. Clear audio, visible documents, steady posture, all small elements that helped keep the meeting from drifting. I rehearsed the opening line under my breath, just once, ensuring it sounded factual rather than defensive. When everything was set, I closed the laptop for a moment, letting the room regain its silence. I poured warm water into a mug and set it beside the binder, letting the steam rise in slow ribbons. I wouldn't need a raised voice or urgent tone tomorrow. Steadiness was the only tool required. The light in the kitchen softened as evening edged in, settling gently across the table in pale gold. I sat for a while, hands loose around the mug, feeling the calm that came from deliberate readiness. Tomorrow would ask for clarity, not emotion, and I had prepared everything I could. The rest, whatever shape it took, would meet me on steady ground. The online meeting room opened with a soft chime, each participant appearing one by one in small, muted squares. My name sat in the corner of my tile, framed by the steady glow of the desk lamp. I could see my sister join a moment later, her microphone off, her expression unreadable in the dim light of her space. The estate attorney adjusted his glasses and confirmed attendance with a calm nod. The silence before the conversation began felt weighted but not hostile, just the kind of quiet that happens when everyone knows the next hour will matter. I straightened the edges of the binder beside me and waited for the attorney to begin. He invited me to speak first, the request delivered in a tone that left no space for debate. I inhaled once, letting the breath settle into my chest, and opened the summary document I had prepared. My voice was even, measured, carrying only what the facts required. I presented the caregiving timeline, the expenses, the corroborating notes, and the sequence of steps that brought us to this moment. I said nothing extra, no stories, no emotion, no attempts to sway. The cursor hovered over each line as I explained it, my tone steady enough to keep the room from drifting into sentiment. The attorney nodded occasionally, taking notes. My sister remained silent. Midway through the overview, my sister attempted to interject with a long explanation about how things felt during the final year. The attorney raised a hand gently, reminding her we were reviewing documented evidence, not interpretations or personal impressions. Her expression tightened, but she muted herself again. I continued presenting, grateful for the structure that kept the conversation anchored. The facts stood in their own light: dates, receipts, records, signatures. As each slide appeared, the tension in the room thinned slightly, replaced by something cooler and more factual. No one rushed, and nothing was dismissed. When I reached the section on lost wages, I paused just long enough to ensure everyone could see the column clearly. The numbers weren't dramatic, but they were undeniable. The attorney leaned closer, adjusting his screen to read them. My sister's eyes softened a fraction as she looked at the totals, though she said nothing. The quiet acknowledgement was enough. These hours had been real, paid for not in emotion, but in the currency of time and forfeited work. I moved on, maintaining the same steady cadence, letting the evidence fill the space without pushing it. I concluded with the final line. Reimbursement completed first, remaining assets divided evenly after. The simplicity of the statement held the entire process together. The attorney asked if either party disagreed with the structure. My sister hesitated, then shook her head slowly. Her voice finally emerged, soft, careful. "It's fair," she said. Not enthusiastic, not warm, but honest in its restraint. The attorney documented her acknowledgement in the meeting notes, tapping the keys with measured precision. A part of me relaxed, though I didn't allow the emotion to reach my voice. As the meeting wrapped, a flicker from the overhead bulb in my room caught the corner of my eye, a brief tremor of light before it steadied again. I closed the shared document and folded my hands, listening to the attorney outline the next steps. My sister nodded quietly, her gaze lowered, the tension in her shoulders gentler than before. When the session ended, the screen dissolved into its familiar blank desktop, leaving only the soft hum of the room behind me. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle. The path forward was clear now, and the work had finally shifted from proving to completing. After the meeting ended, I shut the laptop and let the quiet of the room return, fuller now, stretching into the corners like a slow exhale. I sat back in my chair, thinking of something Dad once told me. Don't fight over money. It ruins people. The words pressed lightly against my ribs, not as a reprimand, but as a reminder of what he valued. I wasn't fighting, I knew that. I was adjusting the record to match the truth. Still, the echo of his voice softened the air around me. I placed my palm on the closed binder, letting the cool surface steady my thoughts. Outside, the street lamp flickered once, then settled into a steady glow. I whispered, mostly to myself, "I'm not arguing, I'm correcting." The statement felt like it belonged somewhere, spoken out loud even if no one else heard it. The room held the words without judgment. I opened the binder again, flipping to the last section, and removed one small entry. A minor expense that was technically valid but carried the risk of being misunderstood. I didn't need to keep anything that could distract from clarity. The gesture wasn't about concession, it was about precision. I folded the removed note, placed it gently into a side envelope, and returned to the clean column that remained. Everything felt steadier once the excess was gone. My sister texted unexpectedly. "Thanks for removing that part." No emojis this time, no sharp edges, just a single sentence, almost level. I read it without reacting, then marked the message as acknowledged in the communication log. There was nothing to say yet. No victory, no reconciliation. Just a small recognition of a step taken. I returned to the binder and wrote a quiet line at the bottom of the ledger draft. Correction, not retaliation. The ink settled gently into the paper, the phrase short enough to avoid sentiment, clear enough to hold the intention behind everything I had done so far. I closed the ledger for a moment and flexed my hands, easing the faint stiffness in my fingers. The work had shaped entire days, but it had also given them structure. The kitchen light hummed above me, casting a steady glow across the pages. I sat with the binder open but untouched, letting my breathing fall into an easy rhythm. There was no urgency tonight, no file left unchecked, no deadline looming. The space felt balanced, as though the room itself recognized the shift from defense to preparation. I glanced at the clock, surprised to see how much of the day had passed without me noticing. I turned to the last page of the ledger and wrote one more line, smaller this time. Correction, not revenge. The distinction mattered. Revenge eats at memory, correction preserves it. The words weren't for my sister, or the attorney, or anyone else who might eventually read them. They were for me. A quiet anchor in a process that could easily tilt into bitterness if left unchecked. I capped the pen and set it aside, sliding the binder slightly closer to the center of the table, as though giving the day's work a place to rest. When I finally closed the binder, the air in the room felt a little lighter, as if the pages inside had settled into their rightful order. My back relaxed against the chair, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt a subtle but undeniable release in my shoulders. I sat there a moment longer, breathing slowly, letting the calm widen around me. The night outside was still, the porch quiet, the street almost empty. I rested my hand on the cover once more before standing. For now the work was done, and the path ahead, though still long, felt clearer than it had in weeks. I uploaded Ledger 02 to the probate portal early the next morning, watching the progress bar move slowly across the screen. Each file, receipts, statements, confirmations, slipped into the system one by one, until the final green check appeared. A digital receipt popped up almost immediately, stamped with the clerk's initials. I saved the confirmation in 3 different folders, printed a hard copy and placed it behind the most recent tab in the binder. There was something reassuring about seeing the timestamp sitting cleanly beneath the document title. For the first time, the work wasn't just mine anymore. It now lived in the process, in the system built to handle exactly these matters. I closed the laptop and let the quiet sink in. My sister suggested removing the grocery receipts from the reimbursement list, insisting they counted as normal household expenses. I reviewed the entries carefully. Some were indeed tied to regular meals, while others captured late-night runs for specific medical needs. I separated them cleanly, moving the ambiguous ones into the non-reimbursable column without hesitation. It wasn't worth an argument, and clarity always came first. I updated the spreadsheet, double-checked the totals, and noted the adjustment in the margin. When I sent her the revised file, I kept the message short. Changes reflected. Nothing more, nothing less. The estate attorney responded later in the afternoon, noting the revisions with a short line. Good progress. His tone was neutral, but the acknowledgement added a quiet steadiness to the day. It meant we were moving in the right direction. Less resistance, more alignment. I reviewed his comments, made a few small adjustments he recommended, and uploaded the final versions to the shared folder. Each click felt intentional, the way small stones settle into place before a foundation hardens. The process didn't require enthusiasm. It required accuracy. And accuracy was something I could always bring. I reconfirmed the reimbursement total, running the numbers through the calculator twice to ensure nothing had shifted after the edits.
The final figure appeared on the screen with a clean, unbroken line. No odd cents, no confusing decimals, just a straightforward amount that mirrored the work done. I compared it with the original calculation and felt a subtle exhale leave my chest. Consistency mattered more than anything else at this point. I noted the number in the ledger, careful to keep the handwriting even, and placed a copy of the summary in the front pocket of the binder for quick access during the signing. I sent the final version of the reimbursement agreement to my sister and the attorney, marking it clearly as the document to be signed at the next meeting. There were no comments left to resolve, no red marks waiting in the margins. The digital copy felt clean, almost elegant in its simplicity. After sending it, I printed 2 hard copies, each crisp and uncreased. I aligned them neatly on the table, sliding them into protective sleeves. The sound of the binder rings opening felt almost ceremonial. I inserted the documents carefully, letting them settle into their place at the front of the file. I added a final note to myself at the bottom of my planner. Print 2 additional hard copies tomorrow. The routine felt mechanical now, but not in a draining way, more like a steady rhythm guiding the last steps of a long process. I pressed the binder closed, the cover flattening over the pages with a muted firmness. The room around me warmed slightly in the afternoon light, making the edges of the paper glow a pale gold. For a moment, I rested my fingertips on the spine, letting the quiet confirm what the documents already showed. We were almost through the hardest part. When I opened the binder that evening, the metal edge caught my finger. Just a thin scrape, bright and sharp enough to leave a narrow red line across the skin. I watched the mark bloom for a moment, more surprised than hurt. It felt almost symbolic, the kind of accident that arrives quietly after weeks of precision. I rinsed the cut under warm water, letting the sting fade before wrapping it with a small piece of paper tape. The white strip stood out against my hand, a soft interruption in the otherwise methodical work. When I returned to the table, the binder waited exactly where I'd left it, steady and unchanging. I opened it carefully this time, mindful of the corners, settling back into the task with renewed attention. I pressed the tape across the small wound, smoothing its edges until it lay flat. The gesture felt gentle, an act with no urgency, no frustration, just quiet correction. Then I returned my focus to the binder, slipping my hand beneath the cover more cautiously than before. The documents inside rustled softly, a thin whisper of paper against plastic. I adjusted a few pages that had shifted, aligning the top edges, making sure each sleeve sat flush. The cut throbbed once, a small reminder of how easily skin gives way compared to the steadiness of ink and paper. I let the sensation pass and continued sorting without pause. My sister sent another message, this one an emoji of arms stretched in a vague gesture of comfort. It was unexpected. Not an apology, not an explanation, just something meant to ease the tension without naming it. I looked at it for a long moment before setting the phone aside. I didn't answer. Not out of coldness, but because words weren't needed yet. The process had its own rhythm, and any reply at this stage risked pulling us back into sentiment rather than structure. I opened the binder again and checked the next file, ensuring the digital signature on the scanned version displayed correctly. Silence in this moment felt steadier than response. I scrolled through the scanned documents one more time,
examining the signature markers on the digital copies. Each one glowed faintly green, confirming their validity. I took my time with the review, wanting to be certain every element matched what the attorney required. A small hum filled the room, the refrigerator shifting cycles, the settling creak of the house as evening deepened. These sounds had become part of the process, a quiet soundtrack to the weeks of preparation. I saved the files again, though they didn't need saving, and organized them into a final folder. The order, once again, felt like a kind of calm. I poured warm water into a glass and set it beside the laptop. My throat softened as I drank, easing the dryness that came from hours of reading fine print and reviewing details. The warmth drew a thin line down my chest, grounding me. Returning to the table, I reviewed the list of items needed for tomorrow's meeting. Everything was accounted for: scans, printouts, confirmations. I checked the microphone again, then placed the water beside the binder as though staging the space for the next day's work. Preparation had become almost a ritual now, one that steadied the mind as much as the documents. I drafted the email for tomorrow's session. We will proceed with the formal signing. The subject line was simple, direct, with no excess phrasing. The body of the message held only the necessary details: time, documents, expectations. After attaching the files, I read the email again, before saving it as a draft. The room felt still, balanced between anticipation and completion. I closed the binder gently, letting the weight settle back into place. Then I sat back in my chair, one hand resting loosely on the cover. The work for the day was done, and for the first time that week, I felt a slight ease move through my shoulders. I emailed 2 versions of the pathway forward that morning. Option A: reimbursements completed first, then distribution. Option B: distribution allowed, but only after deductions were applied in clearly itemized form. I outlined the legal risks of the second option: ambiguity, potential disputes, the possibility of misinterpretation down the line. I sent the document to both my sister and the attorney, attaching a short explanation of why one route offered clarity and the other invited complication. The words were simple, uncolored by emotion. When I hit send, the room felt steady, as though everything had been placed squarely on the table. The binder sat open beside me, its pages reflecting the morning light in a thin, even strip. My sister replied half an hour later with a single question: "Which one do you want?" She didn't challenge, didn't bargain, just asked. I answered with equal simplicity: A. Clear, clean, minimal dispute. The message felt like a small turn in the conversation, the first time she had approached the process without pushing back. Her reply arrived quickly. Okay. Nothing added, nothing softened, nothing implied. I placed the phone beside the binder, careful not to read more into the moment than what was there. Acceptance, even in its plainest form, had a weight of its own. The attorney responded soon after, agreeing with the choice. His message was brief: Option A reduces long-term conflict. I recommend proceeding. The straightforward endorsement added a quiet structure to the day. I saved the email with the others, then printed a copy for the binder. The crisp paper warmed slightly under my fingers as it slid into its sleeve. Each confirmation, each clean endorsement, made the entire process feel steadier. The room seemed to reflect that steadiness back at me, sunlight shifting across the table in a slow, measured arc. I sent 2 available time slots for the signing. Within minutes, my sister chose one, without asking to move it, adjust it, or delay it. I marked the time in my planner and set a reminder on my phone. The calendar alert chimed softly, a small, precise sound that echoed the simplicity of the exchange. I looked over the table, documents stacked, pens lined neatly, the binder closed but ready. The feeling wasn't anticipation, not exactly. It was more like standing at the edge of something that had taken shape through weeks of careful work, a shape that finally held. I printed the final label for the folder. Final. The letters dried quickly, bold, but not dramatic. I affixed the label to the tab and pressed along the edges until it stuck firmly. The folder felt lighter than the others, not because it held fewer pages, but because it carried no uncertainty. I placed it beside the binder, aligning the corners so both sat flush. The faint smell of warm ink from the printer drifted across the table, mixing with the steady quiet of the house. Everything was ready for the next day. I pushed the chair back slightly and rested my elbows on the window ledge. The curtains moved with a soft breeze, brushing my arm like a passing thought. Outside, the yard was still, the air cool enough to calm the pulse that had carried me through weeks of sorting, preparing, clarifying. For a moment, I let the quiet expand. No documents to analyze, no messages to interpret, no numbers left unresolved. The day was set. I closed the binder with a gentle motion and placed the pen beside it. Whatever waited on the other side of tomorrow's meeting, I would meet it with the same steadiness that had brought me here. My sister called late in the evening, her voice thinner than usual, as if something inside her had unraveled after holding tight for too long. She didn't argue, she didn't accuse. She simply began talking. Memories of Dad, moments from years ago, the kind that surface only when grief has softened enough to let them float upward. I listened without interrupting, the phone pressed lightly to my ear. She spoke about the afternoons he used to fix things around the house, about his quiet humor, about how she regretted missing more than she'd realized. Her words weren't directed at me, not exactly. They were spoken into the open air, carried by a need to be heard by someone who lived those years alongside her. At one point she asked, "Are we still sisters after all this?" The question landed gently, without accusation, but laced with the uncertainty that comes from navigating loss and responsibility at the same time. I answered with the same calm I had carried through every step of the process. "We are, when we respect each other." There was a pause on the line, a kind of stillness that felt weighted but not heavy. She didn't push back, didn't retreat into defensiveness. She just breathed, once, softly. I let the quiet sit between us without trying to fill it. Some truths need space before they can settle. I reminded her of the plan for tomorrow in one clear sentence. No lecturing, no pressure, just the practical outline. We sign option A, then we can have dinner afterward. She exhaled, the sound full of ambivalence and something close to relief. "Okay," she said. Not reluctant, not enthusiastic, just honest. The call softened as we moved into lighter topics, small bits of conversation that, for the first time in weeks, didn't circle back to numbers or documents. When she finally said goodnight, her voice had steadied. I stayed on the line for a second after she hung up, listening to the faint tone before placing the phone on the table. I texted her the directions to the signing office, keeping the message neutral and brief. The building was easy to find, but I included a note about parking in case the lot was crowded. She responded with a simple, "Got it," followed by a short pause. The small exchange held none of the tension from earlier weeks. It felt procedural, yes, but not cold. Practical, not strained. I closed the messaging app and set the phone beside the binder, mentally walking through the steps of tomorrow. Confirm IDs, review documents, sign, copy, finalize. The clarity of the process eased something in me, a quiet understanding that the hardest conversations were already behind us. Before going to bed, I laid out the documents needed for the signing. ID, ledger summary, final agreement, confirmations. I aligned each paper on the table, smoothing any edges that curled slightly. The room was dim except for the warm pool of light from the lamp. I checked each signature field twice, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. My hands moved with a steadiness that came from weeks of repetition. When everything was set, I placed the binder on top, its weight familiar, its purpose clear. The house around me was quiet, the night outside still. I sent one last message that night. Bring your ID tomorrow. No reminders, no cautions, just the essential detail. She replied within a minute, "Will do." I set the phone down and let the silence reclaim the room. My shoulders eased as I turned off the lamp, leaving only the faint glow from the porch filtering through the curtains. I stood for a moment in the doorway, allowing the calm to settle into my breath. Tomorrow would be straightforward. Not easy, exactly, but defined. I stepped away from the table, letting the documents rest where they were, ready for morning. The next morning, I gathered the financial statements for transport and medication expenses. Each bank transfer annotated with dates, times, and short descriptions. I printed the key statements, marking the transaction codes with a thin underline so they could be traced easily. The pages looked orderly. The figures lined up in quiet rows that reflected not just money spent, but the rhythm of caregiving that had shaped entire seasons. I placed the statements flat on the table, smoothing them with the side of my hand. They carried no emotion, only accuracy. The morning light filtered through the blinds, making pale stripes across the paper. I slid each sheet into a protective sleeve and added them to the binder, letting the weights settle evenly. Some of the bills were faded, ink softened by time, corners curled slightly, but they were still legible. I took photos of the weaker prints,
adjusting the angle until the numbers were clear. Then, I attached a small caption beneath each scan, noting the source and date. The older receipts held their own kind of truth. They weren't dramatic pieces of evidence, just quiet records of late-night errands, emergency purchases, and the small necessities that had accompanied every shift in Dad's health. I arranged the digital copies neatly, labeling them with timestamps that matched the originals. When they were all organized, I sat back and let the calm settle in. The attorney reviewed the uploaded files in real time and sent a brief message. Documents complete. 2 words, simple but definitive. It was the first formal acknowledgement that nothing else was missing. Relief didn't rush through me. It arrived slowly, like a door opening a fraction wider. I saved his message in the communication folder and printed a hard copy for the binder. The confirmation sat at the front of the section now, a quiet marker of progress. I breathed in deeply, letting the room's stillness match the steadiness inside my chest. For the first time in days, I felt the process click into place. My sister responded with a short, "Okay," the message landing without hesitation or complaint. It wasn't celebratory, just factual, the way an acknowledgement should be when everyone finally agrees on the same version of reality. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I reviewed the zipped file one more time, ensuring everything was included. Receipts, statements, signatures, logs. I checked the folder size, then uploaded the final archive to our shared directory. When the status bar reached the end, I exhaled, the breath leaving me in a slow, even line. The digital structure now mirrored the physical one, complete, consistent, intact. I compressed all the documents into a zip file labeled care.ream.final.zip, a name that felt clean and unambiguous. Then, I saved a backup copy onto an external drive, letting the quiet click of the device mark the moment. The downloaded folder sat neatly on the desktop, its icon small but carrying months of labor. I opened it once, scanning through every subfolder, transport, medication, care logs, statements, to ensure nothing had vanished in the process. Everything was there, each document just where it belonged. I closed the window gently, as though not to disturb the order I had worked so hard to create. That night, I went to bed early for the first time in weeks. The room felt cooler, the sheets softer, the quiet deeper than it had been in a long while.
I lay still, letting exhaustion unfold slowly rather than crash over me. The binder rested on the desk across the room, closed and undemanding. The feeling wasn't triumph, just relief, steady and quiet. As my breathing slowed, the weight of unfinished work finally loosened from my body. The house settled around me, gentle and unhurried. Sleep came without resistance. We sat across from each other the next afternoon in a small conference room, the attorney's desk between us like a neutral shoreline. I opened the binder to the page with Dad's signature, one of the older forms he had signed early in his illness, the ink slightly faded but still readable. My sister's gaze slowed when she saw it. Her shoulders shifted downward, not in defeat, but in a quiet recognition that the path we'd taken to reach this point had been rooted in something real. The attorney nodded for me to begin, and I outlined the sequence of steps with calm precision. My voice held steady, even as the room thickened with unspoken memories. I presented the facts in a measured way, limiting myself to 5 minutes, as planned. Each point followed the next like a clean line of stitching. Hours logged, expenses advanced, statements confirmed. I pointed to the supporting pages but didn't dwell on them. My sister listened without interruption. Her jaw softened slightly, her posture less tense than I'd expected.
For the first time, it felt like she wasn't looking for a gap in my explanation but following the structure as it unfolded. The attorney took sparse notes, his pen scratching lightly, a steady background rhythm that kept the room grounded. When we reached the section on lost wages, I saw her swallow once, a subtle movement but noticeable. She looked at the figures quietly, then gave a small nod. "I didn't realize that," she said, her voice low. She didn't say the word sorry, but her face carried the shape of it. I didn't move to fill the silence or soften the moment. Acknowledgement, even in its simplest form, mattered more than any apology she might have forced. The attorney continued reading aloud from the document, bridging the pause without disturbing it. He recited the reimbursement summary line by line, confirming each amount and explaining where it appeared in the agreement. My sister followed along, tracing the figures with her eyes. Her earlier resistance had dissolved into something quieter, something like acceptance. When he asked whether she agreed with the reimbursement total, she nodded again. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper, but firm in its clarity. The attorney made a note beside her acknowledgement, underlining it once. The clean sound of his pen touched the room like a confirmation we had all been moving toward. We shifted to the final item, splitting the remainder evenly. I stated the plan calmly, the same phrasing I had used in the meeting earlier that week. Once reimbursement is completed, the remaining assets are divided 50-50. She met my eyes and said, "That's fair." It wasn't a dramatic moment, no swell in tone, no sudden warmth, just agreement, steady, direct, unadorned. The attorney documented our statements, his voice even as he summarized the terms. The room felt lighter as he spoke, as though something that had been dense for weeks finally loosened its grip. I placed the pen on the table and let my hands rest. A quiet relief spread through me. Not sudden, not overwhelming. Just a gentle easing across the chest. My sister exhaled, a sound that barely broke the room's stillness, then folded her hands in her lap. The attorney closed the folder neatly and thanked us for our cooperation. We nodded in unison, a small alignment after so many missteps. As we stood, the tension that had lingered at the edges of every conversation seemed to recede. The meeting had done what it needed to do. The path ahead felt clearer, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the edges of calm returning. The attorney reviewed the settlement one final time, suggesting a small adjustment. A cap on 2 minor categories to keep the totals clean and prevent any potential questions later. The recommendation wasn't a challenge. It was a refinement. The last layer of polish on a process that had already taken shape. I considered the changes carefully, reading each line while the room waited in a steady hush. They didn't alter the core agreement,
only clarified its edges. I nodded. That works. My sister looked between us, then gave her own small nod of agreement. The attorney marked the revision with a thin line of blue ink, his movements practiced and calm. The document felt settled now. Not just correct, but complete. My sister asked quietly if she could keep one of Dad's belongings. Something small, but meaningful enough to her that she hesitated before naming it. I didn't need to ask which item. I simply said, "Choose whatever you'd like." Her shoulders eased just slightly. The request wasn't about the estate. It was about holding on to a piece of him that felt personal. There was no need to weigh it against anything. She looked down at her hands, thumb brushing the side of her palm, and whispered, "Thank you." The moment was brief, but it carried a softness that hadn't been present in any of our earlier conversations. We signed the settlement in silence, each page turned carefully by the attorney. My signature flowed easily, steady from repetition and preparation. My sister's followed, her pen pausing once before continuing. The sound of ink settling into paper felt like a quiet closure, the kind that doesn't need ceremony to feel final. When the attorney gathered the signed pages and clipped them together, the soft click echoed like a marker at the end of a long sentence. There was no applause, no relief spoken out loud, just the clean, factual completion of a process that had asked for patience and steadiness from both of us. The attorney stamped the agreement with a firm, even motion. The sound was round and certain, the kind that leaves no ambiguity about what has been finalized. He handed us the acknowledgement receipts, explaining the next administrative steps in a composed tone. I accepted mine and slipped it into a protective sleeve in the binder. The paper was still warm from the machine, its edges crisp. My sister folded hers carefully before placing it in her purse. When we stood, the air in the room felt lighter, no longer thick with lingering tension but simply quiet, as though the walls themselves understood the shift from conflict to resolution. Before leaving, I photographed the stamped pages and saved them into the final folder on my phone. The habit had become automatic by now. Document, verify, store. The photos aligned in perfect sequence, each one clear and properly framed. I closed the binder and placed it upright in my bag. The weight felt different now. Not heavy with unfinished work, but solid in a way that matched the certainty of what we had just completed. My sister watched, then gave a small nod. "Looks good," she said. Not as a concession, but as an acknowledgement. I returned the nod, and for a moment we simply stood there, sharing the same quiet ground. As we stepped out of the room, I said softly, "That was the hardest part." It wasn't a question, and she didn't contradict it. Her exhale matched mine. Slow, even. Something like relief, but without the release of celebration. We walked side by side down the hallway, our footsteps steady on the polished floor. The day outside was cool and bright, a contrast to the stillness of the room we'd just left. Whatever remained ahead, distributions, practical tasks, small decisions, felt manageable now. The foundation was set. The hardest part was behind us. We finalized the distribution later that afternoon, sitting at the long table outside the attorney's office. The numbers were straightforward now, clean, balanced, without any lingering questions. I wrote the figures into my copy of the ledger, noting the final totals with even strokes. My sister reviewed her copy beside me, her expression calm, no trace of the tension that had once clung to every conversation we had. The math didn't ask for debate. It only required acknowledgement. We checked each line together, then signed the bottom of the summary page. It felt less like division and more like closure, the kind rooted in clarity rather than sentiment. When the final sheet was signed, she asked quietly, "Do you want to grab dinner after this?" The question landed softly, without weight or expectation. I let a small, tired smile surface. "Something warm," I answered, keeping the tone light. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden thaw. just two people who had walked through a difficult process and found themselves standing on the same ground again. She tucked her hair behind her ear, a familiar gesture from years ago, and nodded. For a moment we simply breathed the same steady air. I photocopied the signed documents, sliding each page through the machine until the full set lay in two neat stacks. The warm paper collected in the output tray felt crisp, carrying the final imprint of every decision we had made. I placed her copies into a plain envelope and handed it to her without ceremony. She accepted it with both hands, pressing the flap gently. "Thank you," she said, "not for the paperwork, but for the steadiness that had carried us here." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed the binder and felt its familiar weight settle into my palms, a weight that no longer felt like a burden. The attorney emailed the official confirmation of distribution. The subject line straightforward: "Distribution completed." I saved the message to the archive and forwarded a copy to my sister. She wrote back a simple "received." There was something quiet and final in that single word. No tension, no hesitation, just acknowledgement of the last administrative step. I shut the laptop and let the certainty of completion fill the room. The house felt different now, as if a long, suspended moment had finally landed. I cleared the table slowly, stacking pens, gathering stray printouts, closing folders. The room's light shifted as I moved, falling across the surface in small rectangles that warmed the paper edges. I powered down the printer, its soft whir fading into silence. When I turned off the computer, the screen dimmed gradually, leaving only the muted glow of the lamp. The quiet had a depth to it, a kind of ease I hadn't felt in weeks. I sat for a moment, letting the stillness wrap around me. Before leaving the room, I sent my sister one final message. "Thank you for respecting the process." No embellishment, no additional sentiment. Just the truth of what had made everything possible. She replied after a pause. "Thank you for keeping it clear." The exchange was small, but it settled gently between us, light enough not to intrude, solid enough to hold. I slipped the binder into the drawer and closed it softly. The day had ended cleanly, and so had the long stretch of strain that preceded it. I placed the binder into the drawer that evening, setting it down with a gentleness I hadn't been capable of in weeks. The weight felt different now, lighter, almost hollow, as if the pages inside had released something the moment our signatures dried. I slid the drawer closed until only a thin line of wood showed between it and the frame. For a moment, I rested my fingers on the handle. The binder had carried more than paperwork. It had held months of quiet labor, years of unspoken responsibility, and the slow unraveling of a family dispute that could have broken us. Now it was just a record, no longer a burden, simply a completed chapter. I exhaled, letting my shoulders ease. When I stepped outside, the porch light clicked off softly, fading into the dusk as if sensing it was no longer needed. The evening air carried a coolness that brushed against my arms, steady and unhurried. The house behind me felt calmer, its walls no longer carrying the weight of constant preparation. I stood on the threshold for a moment, watching the remaining traces of daylight slip across the yard. It wasn't dramatic, just an ordinary scene that felt newly uncluttered. I let the darkness settle naturally without switching the light back on. Sometimes the ending of a long task is marked not by brightness, but by the absence of strain. Inside, I sent my sister a photo of Dad from years ago, a moment we both loved, one where he was laughing at something none of us remembered. I didn't add a caption. The image didn't need one. A few minutes later, she responded with a simple heart, small and unobtrusive. It wasn't reconciliation in a grand sense, But it was genuine, and that was enough. The tension that had shaped so many of our conversations seemed to thin, leaving behind only what could be carried forward. I set the phone down, letting the exchange rest without adding anything more. I made a cup of tea and held it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into my palms. The steam rose in slow curls, softening the edges of the kitchen. The quiet was deep, the kind that arrives only after something long and difficult has finally settled. I leaned against the counter, taking a small sip. There was no need to run calculations in my head. No documents waiting, no deadlines humming beneath the surface of my thoughts. The day had folded in on itself neatly, leaving space for something gentler to return. Before heading to bed, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. Correction, then peace. The words didn't feel like a declaration, more like an observation of what the past weeks had demanded. I closed the notebook and placed it beside the lamp, its cover warm under the soft light. It struck me how different the room felt now, how still the air had become. Not empty, just settled, as though every piece had found its place. The simplicity of the moment held more truth than anything I could have added to the page. I stood for a moment in the doorway, letting the silence settle into my breath. The house was dim, the night outside calm. The weight around my chest finally loosened. I inhaled deeply, letting the breath fill me, then released it in a slow, steady line. There were no more documents to revise, no more numbers to defend. Just the quiet after a long journey, the kind that wraps itself gently around the edges of a day. I turned off the last light and walked toward the bedroom, feeling the calm deepen with each step. In the end, it wasn't the numbers that stayed with me. It wasn't the signatures, the receipts, or the hours spent proving what had already been lived. What lingered was the quiet, finally unbroken, between two sisters who had spent months speaking past each other. The binder is tucked away now, its pages no longer carrying the weight of tension, but simply the truth of what happened. My father's photo sits on the corner of my desk, not as a reminder of what we fought over, but of what we almost lost in the process. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes as a single nod across a table, or a soft "thank you" from someone who once stood on the other end of a widening gap. Sometimes it's just the knowledge that you stayed steady, even when the ground beneath you shifted. If you've ever been through something like this, or if this story touched a part of your own, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what resonated with you. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, human, and honest, make sure to hit subscribe. There's so much more ahead.